The note was still on the bedside table when I picked it up the second time. Colin's handwriting neat, the way his mother had taught him. I read it again. Then I sat down and drank the rest of my coffee, which had gone cold an hour ago. The note said, "Back tomorrow, taking care of estate paperwork so you don't have to." He had told me, that morning, that he was handling the insurance forms. I am 63 years old. I spent 22 years as a private investigator before my knees and my patience gave out in roughly equal measure. In that time, I learned that most people who lie do not lie dramatically. They lie in the small words, the substitutions. Insurance becomes estate. Forms becomes paperwork. The distance between those two phrases is not large, but it is not nothing. I set the note back on the table and looked at Margaret. "Ah!" It was the 11th night. I had stopped counting the hours somewhere around day 4, when the numbers stopped meaning anything useful, and started counting the nights. Instead, they were easier to mark, because the ICU quieted after 10 o'clock, and the particular quality of the silence was different from daytime silence. The monitors still beeped. The IV line still dripped, but the hallway outside Margaret's room went still, and in that stillness I could hear her breathing, which was the only sound I needed to track. The room smelled like antiseptic and the faint sweetness of the hand lotion the nurses used when they turned her every 2 hours. There was a chair they had brought in for me on day 2, not a hospital chair, a proper padded one from somewhere in the administrative wing, and I had moved it to the left side of her bed because that was the side she had always slept on at home, and I had slept on the right. And after 38 years, some arrangements become structural. Her hands were on top of the blanket. The hospital gown had short sleeves, and I could see how thin her arms had become in the past 3 months. The oncologist had used the phrase rapid progression in September, and I had written it down in the small notebook I keep in my left breast pocket, because writing things down is a habit I have not been able to break since 1987, and because I did not trust myself to remember it accurately through the noise of everything else he said in that appointment. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The language of it was very clean and very final. Her wedding ring was still on her finger. She had not taken it off in 38 years, not for surgeries, not for gardening, not for the winter of 2009 when her hands had swelled from an allergic reaction and I had been quietly terrified we would have to cut it off. The ring had been her grandmother's originally, a thin gold band with a small inset diamond that caught light differently depending on the angle. Her fingers were thinner now than I had ever seen them. The ring sat loosely, tilted slightly toward her palm. I had thought about asking the nurses to secure it somehow. I had not yet asked. Some things I was not ready to make practical. I had been reading to her in the evenings a novel she had started in August and left on the nightstand with a bookmark at page 214. The doctors had told me, carefully, that hearing was often the last sense to go, and Margaret had always been a reader, and it seemed like the right thing to do. I did not know if she could hear me. I read anyway. We were still on page 214. I had not been able to move past it. Colin arrived at 7:15 the next morning. I heard him before I saw him, his voice in the hallway, pleasant and unhurried, asking one of the nurses how her night had gone. That was Colin's way. He had his mother's social ease, the ability to make strangers feel attended to within 30 seconds of meeting them. I had always admired it without quite being able to replicate it. He came in carrying 2 cups of coffee from the place 2 blocks from the hospital, the one with the paper cups that were slightly too thin for the heat. He handed me one and sat in the visitor's chair near the window. He looked at his mother for a long moment without speaking, and I believed that look was genuine. I still believe that, even now. Whatever else Colin is, he loved his mother. That part was real. "How was last night?" he said. "Quiet," I said. "She was comfortable." He nodded. He asked about her breathing, about whether the pain management team had adjusted the morphine drip, and his questions were specific enough that I could tell he had been paying attention across the previous days. We talked for 20 minutes about practical things, the parking situation, the coffee, whether I had eaten anything since the previous afternoon, which I had not. He told me to go down to the cafeteria. I told him I would go later. Then he said, Dad, let me handle the administrative stuff. Insurance forms. The billing coordination, you don't need that on your plate right now. I've already been in touch with the hospital's patient services office. I told him I appreciated that. I meant it. I was running on 4 hours of sleep across 2 nights, and the thought of navigating insurance paperwork while sitting in an ICU waiting room was exactly the kind of task I did not have the capacity for. I told him to go ahead. He stayed another hour. He spoke to Sandra, the night shift nurse who was finishing her rounds, and thanked her for taking care of his mother. Sandra, a composed woman in her mid-40s who had been on this floor for 11 years. She had told me on day 1, smiled, and said it was her privilege. Colin shook her hand. He was very good at shaking hands. He left around 9:30. He said he would be back in the afternoon. He came back at 2 o'clock. I know because I had just finished the 3rd chapter of Margaret's book. I had finally moved past page 214, though I had not told myself I was doing it when I heard his voice in the hallway, the same pleasant register he used with everyone on the floor. He came in carrying a folder, brown, letter-sized, the kind that closes with a small elastic band. He set it on the table near the door and then sat in the visitor's chair and asked how she was doing. I told him the same as the morning. He nodded. Then he picked up the folder and held it in both hands and said, Dad, I need you to look at something. It's administrative, the estate coordination documents. The financial planner said we should get ahead of it now, while things are still, while we have time. I looked at the folder. It's just a formality, he said. Authorization for me to coordinate on your behalf, so you don't have to deal with phone calls. Paperwork. You can stay here. I did not reach for the folder. I have spent 22 years in a profession where people hand you things and call them formalities. Nothing that requires a signature is a formality. Leave it, I said. I'll look at it later. Something shifted in his expression, not anger, not exactly, but the particular tightening of a man who had expected a different answer and was recalculating. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then it was gone, and he was smiling again. And he said, of course, no rush. He just wanted to make things easier for me. He stayed another 20 minutes. He talked about the parking situation and the coffee and whether the cafeteria on the 2nd floor was any better than the one on the ground floor. Before he left, he picked the folder up from the table near the door and tucked it back under his arm. Sandra Okafor was passing the doorway as he walked out. She had a chart in her hand, and she was moving at the efficient, unhurried pace of someone in the middle of rounds, but I saw her glance at the folder under Colin's arm. Then she glanced at me through the open door. Neither of us said anything. She continued down the hallway. Colin did not look back. I sat in the chair and looked at Margaret's hand on the blanket, the ring tilted toward her palm. He left the room. I watched him go. I did not say what I was thinking. I have learned that silence makes people say things they would not otherwise say. Doctor, Reeves found me in the family consultation room at 11. He was a careful man, the kind of physician who chose his words the way an engineer chooses load-bearing materials not for elegance, but for what they could hold. He sat across from me and told me, in plain language, that Margaret's organ function had declined significantly overnight, that the timeline they had previously estimated 2 to 3 weeks was likely optimistic at this point, that he believed she had, at most, a week, possibly less. I thanked him. He stayed for a few minutes in case I had questions. I had no questions. He left. I sat in that room for 20 minutes. There was a window that looked out onto a parking structure, and I watched a woman in a blue coat try to find her keys at the bottom of her bag for a long time before she found them. Then I went back to Margaret's room. Colin had already gone. The room was quiet. The monitors beeped their steady, indifferent rhythm. On the bedside table, next to Margaret's water cup, and the novel stopped. At page 214, Colin had left a note. His handwriting, neat. I picked it up. Get some rest. Dad, I've handled everything. taking care of estate paperwork so you don't have to worry." I read it once. I read it again. He had told me, that morning, that he was handling the insurance forms. I set the note down. I picked up the coffee cup he had brought me 3 hours earlier. It was cold. I drank it anyway and looked at Margaret's ring, tilted toward her palm, catching no particular light in the gray afternoon coming through the window blinds. Estate paperwork. I had spent 22 years noticing the small substitutions. I had not stopped noticing them just because I had retired. I put the cup down and sat in my chair the left side, her side, and I did not say anything to anyone. The hallway outside Margaret's room went quiet around 10:30. The day nurses finished their final rounds, the overhead lights dimmed to their night setting, and the particular hum of the ICU settled into something lower and more constant machines doing the work that bodies had stopped doing on their own. I had been in that chair for 11 hours. I knew the sound of every pump, every monitor, every footstep on the linoleum outside the door. I was still holding the note when the door opened. She knocked first, 2 quiet knocks, the kind that ask permission rather than announce arrival. She was a woman in her mid-40s, dark-complexioned, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent years learning how to move through difficult rooms without disturbing them. Her badge read, Sandra Okafor, RN, ICU. I had seen her twice during the evening rounds. She had checked Margaret's lines without waking her, and had not made unnecessary conversation, which I had appreciated. She stepped inside and pulled the door nearly closed behind her. She did not come all the way to the chair. She stopped about 4 feet from the door, which told me she was not sure she was going to stay. "Mr. Briggs," she said, and then she stopped. I waited. "I don't know if this is my place," she said. "I've been going back and forth about it since 6 o'clock. I've been here 9 years, this floor, and I've learned that families in this situation don't need more complications." She paused. "But I think I'd rather tell you and be wrong than not tell you and be wrong the other way." I folded the note and set it on the windowsill. "Go ahead," I said. "This afternoon, around 4:15, I saw your son in the small conference room at the end of the hall, the one we use for family consultations, but it wasn't scheduled today. He was with a man I didn't recognize, older, gray suit, carrying a brown leather briefcase. Not a doctor, not hospital staff. The man had a way of setting things on the table that told me he'd done it many times before." She paused. "Before they went in, I heard your son on his phone in the hallway. I wasn't trying to listen. I was at the supply cart, maybe 12 feet away." She looked at me steadily. "He said, 'My father has already agreed. He just can't be there in person.'" The monitor beside Margaret's bed registered a small change in rhythm, then settled. "Did you hear who he was speaking to?" I asked. "No, just that one sentence. Then he saw me and turned toward the window." She said it without apology, which I respected. She had not been eavesdropping. She had simply been present, which is different. "After they went into the conference room," I said, "what did you see?" "I had to pass the room twice during the next hour. The blinds were partially open. The man with the briefcase had documents spread across the table, several pages, organized in stacks. Your son was signing them." She paused, and something shifted in her expression. "He signed more than once, different pages. And I noticed because it struck me as unusual that the signature looked different between the first set of pages and the second. I was quiet for 4 seconds. I know it was 4 because I counted them, the way I used to count them in interview rooms when I was still working, the silence that tells you whether someone is about to add something true or retreat into something safe. Different how, I asked. The first few his own name, I assume, the way anyone signs quickly. But the last 2 or 3 pages, the signature was slower, more deliberate, a different shape entirely. She held my gaze. I've witnessed enough paperwork in 9 years to notice when someone is signing their own name and when they're practicing someone else's. I looked at Margaret. Her chest rose and fell with the mechanical patience of the ventilator, The room smelled of antiseptic and the small bouquet of white carnations Colin had placed on the windowsill 2 days ago, a gesture I had accepted at face value. "The man with the briefcase," I said. "Did you catch a name? Anything on the documents? A letterhead? A card?" Sandra shook her head. "I didn't get close enough. I'm sorry." "Don't be," I said. "I meant it." She stood there for a moment longer. "I hope I haven't made things harder," she said. "I know what you're already dealing with in this room." "You haven't," I said. "Thank you, Sandra." She nodded once, the way people do when they've done something that cost them something, and left. The door closed with a soft click. I sat with it for a moment. 22 years of noticing small substitutions. A note that said estate paperwork instead of insurance forms. A signature that changed shape between the first page and the last. I picked up my phone. The clock read 11:17 p.m. Diane Cho had been my attorney for 14 years. She answered on the first ring. "Walter," she said. No surprise in her voice. She had known me long enough to know that a call at 11:17 on a Thursday was not a social call. "I need you to find out if any document has been filed in the last 48 hours related to Margaret's estate," I said. "Anything amended, anything submitted, anything that has my name on it." A pause. I heard her move the sound of a chair, a light switching on. "How urgent?" she asked. I looked at Margaret's hand, at the ring tilted toward her palm. "Tonight," I said. I called Colin at 7:15 the next morning. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he was already awake, which meant he had been expecting the call. "Hey, Dad!" His voice was even, the kind of even that takes practice. I told him I'd heard there had been a visitor yesterday, a man with a briefcase, a folder, papers. I kept my language loose on purpose. I said I'd heard it from someone on the floor. I didn't say who. Colin didn't hesitate. "Yeah, that was an insurance rep. The supplemental policy Margaret's secondary coverage has a paperwork requirement if the patient is in an inpatient facility past 30 days. I didn't want to bother you with it. You were with her." He paused. "You should have been with her. That's where you needed to be." It was a good answer. It was the kind of answer that explains everything and invites nothing. I had given answers like that myself, years ago, sitting across tables from people who were trying to find the edge of what I knew. "Which company?" I asked. "Meridian Supplemental, the secondary policy you remember. We added it when her oncologist recommended the extended care rider." I did remember the policy. That was the problem. I remembered it well enough to know that Meridian's field representatives did not carry notarial seals. I said nothing about that. Who told you?" "Dad, was it one of the nurses?" His voice shifted slightly, not angry, not defensive, just a degree cooler. "Because the floor staff sometimes see things and think they know what they're looking at. They don't always have the full picture." "I appreciate you handling it," I said. "Of course, you focus on Mom." I hung up. I sat for a moment in the chair by the window, the one with the worn armrest I'd been using for 11 days, and I looked at the parking lot 4 floors below. A man in a gray coat was walking toward a sedan. He was carrying a briefcase. I watched him until he got in the car and drove away. Then I went to find Patrice Holden. Ooh. The administrative offices for the ICU wing were at the far end of the second floor, past the elevator bank, and through a set of doors that required a badge. I had learned, sometime in the first week, that if you stood near the badge reader with a coffee cup in your hand and looked like you belonged, someone would hold the door for you within 4 minutes. A man in his 60s wearing the same clothes he'd slept in does not look like a threat. He looks like a father. People hold doors for fathers. Patrice Holden's office was the second on the left. Her name was on the door in small brass letters. She was at her desk when I knocked a woman in her late 40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a stack of binders on the corner of her desk that had clearly been there long enough to become part of the furniture. I told her my wife was in room 412. I told her I had a question about one of the conference rooms on the ICU floor, the small one at the end of the hall, past the family waiting area. The consultation room, she said. What about it? I'm trying to find out who used it yesterday afternoon, sometime between 2 and 4. She looked at me for a moment, not suspiciously more the way someone looks when they're deciding how much of their job to explain. Then she turned to her computer and typed something. That room doesn't go through the standard booking system, she said. It's technically designated for physician-family consultations. It doesn't require a formal reservation. It's first come. So there's no record of who was in there yesterday. Not in the booking system, no. She looked at her screen a moment longer. Is there something I should know about if there was an incident? No incident, I said. I'm just trying to account for something I saw. I thanked her and stood up. She said, Mr. Briggs. I turned. If you want to know who accessed that hallway, the badge reader logs entries. I'd need a specific reason to pull that. I understand, I said. I'll let you know if it comes to that. I walked back toward the elevator. I pressed the button and waited. The doors opened and I didn't get in. I let them close again. Then I turned and walked to the nurse's station at the front of the ICU floor. Becca was the name on the badge. She looked about 20, with her hair pulled back and a lanyard that had small cartoon dogs on it. She was the kind of person who made the lanyard choice without irony, which made me trust her. I told her I was Walter Briggs, room 412. I said I was trying to track down a man who had come to the floor yesterday afternoon. He'd had a briefcase and a folder. Older, probably mid-60s, jacket and tie. Becca nodded before I finished the description. Yeah, I remember him. He came to the desk and asked for directions to the consultation room. He said his name was... She paused, touching the side of her face. Arthur something. He had a card, I think. He said he was a notary. I kept my voice level. A notary. Yeah, he asked if there was a private space he could use. I was about to ask him who he was there to see, but then she gestured vaguely toward the hallway. Your son was already there. He came out of the family waiting room and said he knew where to go. So, they went together. Did the man show any hospital credentials, a visitor badge? Becca's expression shifted slightly, the look of someone replaying a moment and not liking what they find. He should have signed in. We're supposed to have visitors sign in. She glanced at the logbook on the desk. Your son introduced him. I assumed. It's all right, I said. You didn't do anything wrong. I meant it. She hadn't. Do you remember his last name? The notary. Dempsey. I think Arthur Dempsey. She said it carefully, like she was testing whether the syllables were right. I pulled a paper napkin from the dispenser on the corner of the desk. I didn't have a pen. Becca saw me looking and handed me one without being asked. I wrote the name down. Arthur Dempsey. I folded the napkin and put it in my shirt pocket. Thank you, Becca, I said. She nodded. She was still looking at the logbook when I walked away. No. I didn't call Diane from the hallway. I walked back to Margaret's room first. I stood at the door for a moment and looked at her through the glass, the slow rise of her chest. The monitors. The IV line taped to the inside of her arm. 38 years. The ring tilted toward her palm. I had stopped counting the days since she'd last opened her eyes, because counting made it feel like a deadline. I went in and sat in the chair beside her. I held her hand. I stayed like that for 4 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall. Then I went to the family waiting room at the end of the hall, the one with the bad lighting and the chairs that were designed by someone who had never needed to sit in one for more than 20 minutes, and I called Diane. She answered on the second ring. Arthur Dempsey, I said. Independent notary. Find out what you can. The pause was 3 seconds. I counted. Walter, she said. Her voice had changed register, not alarmed, but precise in the way it gets when she's already ahead of me. Arthur Dempsey handles emergency estate documents, wills, amendments, beneficiary changes. He specializes in hospital and hospice settings. He charges a premium for same day. I looked through the waiting room window at the hallway. The fluorescent light above the consultation room door was on. It hadn't been on when I'd walked past it an hour ago. He was here yesterday, I said. Colin brought him. They used the consultation room. Another pause, shorter this time. I'll make some calls. Diane said. Tonight, I said. I heard you the first time, she said, and she was already moving. I could hear it in the background, the same sounds as the night before. A chair, a light. I hung up and looked at the napkin in my shirt pocket. The name was written in my own handwriting, in blue ink, on a paper napkin from a hospital nurse's station. Arthur Dempsey, notary, emergency estate documents, same-day premium. I had spent 21 years as a private investigator. I had learned early that the most useful thing you can do when you suspect something is to find the one person who wasn't trying to hide it, the person who told you the name without knowing why you were asking, who handed you a pen without hesitating, who remembered the face because they were doing their job and their job required them to pay attention. Becca had paid attention. I folded the napkin again and put it back in my pocket. Then I walked back to room 412 and sat down beside my wife, and I did not touch my phone again for the rest of the morning. Diane called at 2:14 in the afternoon. I was sitting in the chair I had occupied for 11 days, the one the night staff had quietly replaced with a padded version sometime during the first week. Without my asking, Margaret was breathing steadily, which the monitors confirmed and which I could hear if I sat close enough. I had learned to read the rhythm of it. I had learned what the small sounds meant and what the silences between them meant. My phone buzzed once on the armrest. I stepped into the hallway before answering. I found it, Diane said. She did not say hello. We had been past hello for 20 years. Arthur Dempsey filed an amendment to last will and testament with the Davidson County Clerk's office yesterday afternoon. Timestamp is 4:47 p.m. I did not say anything. Walter, the document lists 2 signatures, Margaret Briggs and Walter Briggs. The hallway outside room 412 has a window at the far end that faces the hospital parking structure. I had looked at that window many times over the past 11 days without seeing it. I saw it now, the concrete levels of the structure, a red sedan on the second floor, a pigeon sitting on the ledge. What's in it? I asked. I don't have the full text yet. The clerk's office requires a court order for documents filed under estate proceedings when the testator is still living. I can have the order in 24 hours, maybe less if Judge Farrow's clerk is cooperative, but the filing itself is confirmed. Dempsey's name is on it as notary. The timestamp is real. I thought about 4:47 p.m. yesterday. I had been in room 412 at 4:47 p.m. yesterday. I had been in room 412 since 8 in the morning, when the day nurse had come in to check Margaret's IV lines and I had stood by the window while she worked. I had left the room once 20 minutes, perhaps 25, when Dr. Reeves had asked to speak with me in the family consultation room down the hall. He had explained, again, what the imaging from Monday showed. I had listened. I had asked 2 questions. I had walked back. That was the only time I had left. I had not met Arthur Dempsey. I had not spoken to Arthur Dempsey. I had not signed any document, not a consent form, not a visitor log, not a napkin. My hand had touched nothing yesterday except the railing of Margaret's bed, and once, her fingers when she moved slightly in the early afternoon, and I thought she might wake. Get the order, I said. I'm already drafting it. Diane. I paused. The pigeon on the ledge shifted, then settled. The signature, my signature. Is there any possibility, any procedural pathway where my name could appear on a document I didn't sign? She was quiet for 3 seconds. Diane Cho was not a woman who needed 3 seconds to think about most things. Not on a notarized estate amendment. She said, Dempsey would have had to witness the signing in person. That's the requirement. That's the whole point of notarization. Then someone signed my name, I said, and Dempsey either watched it happen or he didn't watch closely enough. She said she would call me the moment the order was processed. I thanked her, and that ended the call. I stood in the hallway for a while. I had spent 21 years in rooms like this, not hospital hallways, but spaces between knowing and proving, where the shape of what happened was already clear, and the only remaining work was documentation. I had learned not to move too fast in that space. Moving fast was how you made mistakes. Moving fast was how the other side found the errors you'd left behind. I went back into room 412 and sat down. Margaret's face was very still. She had lost weight in the past 2 weeks, more than the weeks before, which had already taken more than I had wanted to see. But her face and stillness had a quality I had known for 38 years, a quality I could not name precisely, only recognize. I had recognized it the first time I saw her, across a table at a faculty mixer neither of us had wanted to attend, when she had looked up from a book she was reading in the corner and made a face at the room that said exactly what I was thinking. I was not thinking about the document. I was thinking about that face. Then I was thinking about Colin. It was the first time in 11 days that I had sat beside my wife and thought about something other than my wife. Colin arrived at 6:40 in the evening. He was wearing a gray jacket. I recognized he'd had it for years, and he carried a paper coffee cup from the cart on the ground floor. He set the cup on the table by the door, which was a habit he had, leaving things near exits. He asked how Margaret's numbers had looked today. I told him the same as yesterday. He nodded and stood by the bed for a few minutes, looking at his mother with an expression I watched carefully and could not entirely read. Then he turned to me and asked if I had eaten. I told him I had. He asked if I needed anything from the house. I told him no. He sat in the chair near the window, the smaller one, the one visitors used, and we remained in the room together without speaking for a while, which was not unusual. We had never been a family that required noise to fill a room. Margaret had always said that was one of the things she valued about us, that we could be quiet together without it meaning something was wrong. Tonight it meant something was wrong. Colin stayed for 40 minutes. He checked his phone twice, both times briefly, both times returning it to his jacket pocket without responding to whatever he had seen. Before he left, he touched the railing at the foot of Margaret's bed, just a light touch. One hand, for a moment, and then he said goodnight to both of us, though Margaret could not hear him, and walked out. I watched the door after it closed. In the hallway, through the narrow window set into the door, I could see the nursing station. Sandra Okafor was there, standing at the counter with a chart open in front of her. She had come on shift at 6. As Colin passed the station, she looked up. He did not look at her. She watched him until he turned the corner toward the elevators. Then she looked at the door of room 412. She looked at me. I looked back at her. Neither of us moved. Neither of us said anything. The glass between us was small, and the hallway was dim, and there was nothing to say yet, not tonight. Not without the order, not without the full document in Diane's hands. But Sandra Okafor had been a nurse for long enough to know what she had seen, and I had been an investigator for long enough to know what I knew. I turned back to Margaret. The monitors kept their rhythm. The room was very quiet. I picked up the book from the table beside me, the one Margaret had been reading before the hospital, still open to page 214, still waiting, and I held it without opening it. No. He came back at 9:15. I had not expected him. Visiting hours on the ICU floor were technically over at 9, but the night staff knew me well enough by then that they did not enforce it for family, and Colin had his mother's ease with people. He had always been able to move through spaces as though he belonged in them. He stood in the doorway for a moment without coming in. Then he stepped inside and looked at Margaret for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked at me, his voice was very quiet. She would have wanted me to handle this. Dad, you know that. She always said I was the practical one. He paused. She told me once, this was maybe 2 years ago, she said she wanted to know the house would be taken care of, that things would be in order. She didn't want you to have to deal with all of it alone. I did not answer. I'm just trying to do what she would have wanted, he said. I looked at Margaret. The ventilator moved her chest with its slow, mechanical patience. She had been unconscious for 6 days. She had not told Colin anything 2 years ago that contradicted what she had put in writing 11 years ago in a notary's office with her reading glasses on. I said nothing. Colin stood there for another moment. Then he said goodnight and walked out. Through the narrow window in the door, I could see the nurse's station. Sandra Okafor was there. She had heard him. The consultation room was close. The hallway was quiet, and Colin had not been speaking softly. She was looking at the door of room 412. She looked at me through the glass. Her expression did not change. She looked the way people look when they have heard something they already knew and are no longer surprised by it. She turned back to her chart. I set the book down on the table. The hearing was at 9 in the morning. Diane arrived at 9:14 in the morning. I knew the time because I had been watching the clock above the nurse's station since 7 o'clock when I had finally stopped pretending to sleep in the chair beside Margaret's bed. She came through the main entrance of the ICU ward carrying a leather portfolio under her arm and wearing the same dark blazer she'd had on the night before, and I understood from the way she walked, measured, unhurried, like someone who has already decided what the next 2 hours will look like, that she had not slept either. She found me in the hallway outside room 412. "I have it," she said. We didn't go back to the room. Margaret was sleeping the particular stillness of someone whose body has stopped fighting and started letting go, and I didn't want the sound of paper in there. We walked to the cafeteria on the second floor, the one that smelled like industrial coffee and something sweet that had been sitting under a warming lamp too long. It was early enough that the room was mostly empty. A man in scrubs sat near the window, reading something on his phone. Two women in visitor badges spoke quietly at a corner table. Diane chose a table near the far wall, away from both of them, and set the portfolio down and unzipped it. 11 pages, she said. Filed 2 days ago with the county clerk's office. Arthur Dempsey's notary seal on page 9. She slid the document across the table. I had spent 22 years as a private investigator. I had read hundreds of documents in that time: contracts, affidavits, insurance claims, medical records, letters written by people trying to hide what they meant. I had learned to read slowly, not because I was slow, but because speed is where you miss things. I read the amended will of Margaret Louise Briggs the same way I had read every document that mattered, page by page, line by line. I didn't skip ahead. The language in the first 3 pages was standard, boilerplate phrasing about the revocation of prior wills, declarations of mental competency, the usual architecture of a legal document meant to look like it had been assembled carefully over time. Someone had done their homework. The formatting was clean. The margins were correct. If you were moving quickly, if you were a clerk processing 40 documents that morning, you might not stop. I kept reading. Page 4, it's page 5, page 6. By page 7, the structure of what Colin had done was fully visible. The house on Brentwood Lane, the one Margaret and I had bought in 1991, the one we had painted ourselves over a long weekend in October because we couldn't afford to hire anyone, the one where we had raised 2 children and replaced the roof twice and planted a Japanese maple in the front yard that was now taller than the second-floor windows, was listed under primary real property asset and designated entirely to Colin Briggs. Not Colin and Walter, not the estate, Colin. The joint savings account, $340,000, accumulated over 31 years of careful living, of choosing the cheaper flight and the later model car, and the vacation we could actually afford, $340,000, every cent of which existed because Margaret had insisted we put something away every month, even when every month was difficult. Colin Briggs. The retirement fund, $210,000. The account I had been contributing to since 1987, the one I had not touched even when I could have, even when it would have been easy. Colin Briggs. The car, the contents of the house, a brokerage account I hadn't known Margaret still had from before we were married, worth approximately $44,000. Colin Briggs. My name did not appear in the document. Not once. Not as a surviving spouse. Not as a secondary beneficiary. Not in any capacity. In 11 pages describing the entirety of a life Margaret and I had built together over 38 years. Walter Briggs did not exist. If you've ever sat with something that's true, but that your mind refuses to accept all at once, you know what the next few minutes felt like. I set page 8 down on top of the others, and I looked at the man in scrubs by the window. He was still reading his phone. The two women at the corner table had ordered coffee. The cafeteria smelled the same as it had when I walked in. I picked up page 9. Diane had been waiting. She leaned forward and placed her finger on the lower third of the page, where the signature block was. "Here," she said. The signature read, "Walter Briggs." The handwriting was confident. Whoever had written it had not hesitated. But I have signed my name approximately 40,000 times in my life on contracts, on checks, on birthday cards, on the deed to the house on Brentwood Lane, on my daughter's permission slips when she was 9 years old, and I know my signature the way I know my own face. The angle of the letters, the way the W opens flat, a single clean stroke with no ornamentation, the way the B in Briggs sits low on the line. The W on page 9 had a double loop, a small flourish at the top of the first stroke, curling back on itself before continuing. It was a detail that looked like confidence. It was a detail that was not mine. "The double loop on the W," I said. "Yes," Diane said. "Your W has never done that. I checked against 3 documents you signed when we opened the estate file in 2019. The loop doesn't appear once." She paused. "I've reviewed hundreds of forged signatures in my career. This is a forgery." I looked at the signature for a long time. It was strange, looking at your own name written in someone else's hand. It was stranger than I expected. There was something almost personal about it, the intimacy of someone studying how you write your name and then deciding they could do it better, could make it more convincing, could make it stick. I moved to the second signature block, 2 lines below. "Margaret Louise Briggs." The handwriting was different, lighter. The letters were uneven in a way that might, if you were being charitable, suggest an elderly woman in declining health who had signed with difficulty. If you were being charitable, if you didn't know that Margaret Briggs had been unconscious for 6 days, if you didn't know that she had not held a pen since the morning her daughter drove her to the emergency room and the oncologist used the word weeks instead of months for the first time. If you didn't know any of that, you might look at those uneven letters and think a woman who was sick, who signed because she wanted to, who understood what she was signing. Margaret had been unconscious for 6 days. She could not have signed her name. She could not have signed anything. I set the page down. If you've been with someone for 38 years, if you know the sound they make when they're thinking, if you've watched them sign Christmas cards and checks and the papers for your children's school, and then you see their name written by someone else's hand on a document designed to erase everything you built together, there is a particular quality to that moment. It doesn't feel like anger, not at first. It feels like something colder, like the temperature in the room has dropped 2 degrees and you are the only one who noticed. I looked at Diane. Arthur Dempsey notarized both of these. He did. Knowing that Margaret was a patient in this hospital, his seal is on page 9. He would have been required to confirm that both signatories were present, competent, and signing voluntarily. She folded her hands on the table. He didn't. He certified 2 forged signatures on a legal document. That's notary fraud. That's a criminal offense in this state. He will lose his license, and he will very likely face prosecution. I thought about Arthur Dempsey, the man Sandra had described standing in the corridor with a briefcase. The man who had come to a hospital to do something that required a hospital visit because one of the signatories could not be moved. I thought about what it takes for a man to do that, whether it's money, or fear, or something else entirely. I thought about Colin sitting across from me in this same cafeteria 4 days ago, asking if I'd eaten, asking if I needed anything, his voice carrying exactly the right amount of concern. If you're sitting with this the way I was sitting with it, I hope you'll leave a like. It means more than you know. I folded the document along its original creases, 11 pages, folded back exactly as they had been when Diane took them from the envelope. I set it on the table between us. "How long to file?" I asked. "I prepared the motion last night," Diane said. "Emergency petition to freeze the amended, will pending forgery investigation, simultaneous referral to the district attorney's office for criminal review. I need 1 signature to submit." She opened the portfolio and slid a single page across the table. A pen followed it. I looked at the signature line. In 12 days at Vanderbilt Medical Center, I had signed nothing. I had initialed intake forms in the first hours, the night they brought Margaret in. But since then, nothing. There had been nothing to sign. I had simply been present, which was the only thing I knew how to do. I picked up the pen. I signed my name. The W opened flat. The B sat low on the line. No double loop, no flourish. Just my name, the way I have always written it, on a document that was real. Diane took the page back, reviewed it without expression, and slid it into the portfolio. My phone rang at 6:02 that evening. I was back in room 412 in the chair beside Margaret's bed, holding the book I had not opened, the book she had been reading before the hospital, still open to page 214, still waiting for her to come back to it. The screen said Colin. I let it ring once more before I answered. "Hey, Dad." His voice was easy, unhurried. "Just checking in. I was thinking I could bring dinner. There's that Thai place you like on Charlotte Avenue. I could be there by 7. I looked at Margaret. The monitors kept their rhythm. Her hand was very still on the blanket. "No need," I said. "I'm fine." "You sure you haven't eaten much this week? I just thought—" "I'm sure. Thank you. Colin." A pause. Brief. "Okay, call me if you need anything." "I will." I ended the call and set the phone face down on the table beside the book. Outside the window, the Nashville sky was moving through its last hour of light, the particular orange that comes in late autumn when the sun is low and the air is cold and the city looks, for a few minutes, like something you might want to hold on to. I didn't move. I didn't open the book. I sat with my hands in my lap and I watched the color change, and I thought about 38 years and a Japanese maple that was taller than the second-floor windows, and $340,000 saved one careful month at a time, and a woman who had not held a pen in 6 days. The orange deepened. Then it faded. I picked up the book and turned it face down on the table, so the pages wouldn't lose their place. The knock came at 10:47 in the evening. I know the exact time because I had just checked my watch, a habit from 22 years of field work, the kind of reflex that doesn't leave you even when there's nothing left to investigate. The family waiting room on the 4th floor was empty except for me. The vending machine in the corner hummed at a frequency that I had stopped hearing sometime around day 9. The television was off. I had turned it off on the second night, and no one had turned it back on. Sandra Okafor knocked twice. Softly, the way people knock when they're not sure they have the right to. She was still in her scrubs, the dark blue of the night shift, and she was holding something small in her right hand. A USB drive, the kind you buy in a 3-pack at a drugstore. She said, "Mr. Briggs, I'm sorry to come so late." I told her it was all right. I had not been sleeping. She sat down in the chair across from me, not the one next to me, but across, which I noticed. She set the USB drive on the table between us and kept her hand near it, not touching it, the way you set down something you're not entirely sure you should have picked up in the first place. She said, "I've been a nurse for 9 years. I've worked nights for 6 of them. You see things on the night shift that you don't see during the day. People think the hospital is quieter at night." She paused. "It isn't. It's just that fewer people are watching." I waited. "The evening your son came with the man carrying the briefcase," she said. "I was coming back from the supply room on this floor. The hallway outside room 412, your wife's room, is a dead end. There's no reason to be in that hallway unless you have a patient in 412 or you're going to the supply room. I had just come from the supply room. They were standing near the door." She looked at the USB drive. "I heard your son say that you had agreed, that you had given your authorization by phone, that his word was exhausted, and that you couldn't be present but had given him full authority to act on your behalf." The vending machine hummed. "The other man said he needed verbal confirmation. He said, 'I need verbal confirmation directly from Mr. Briggs before I can proceed.' Those were his exact words. I remember them because I stopped walking. I stood at the end of the hallway, and I stopped. She looked at me directly. 'Your son said you were sleeping. He said you would sign a supplemental document later. He said, let me sign now, and he'll add his signature when he wakes up. And then I heard the sound of a pen. I looked at the USB drive on the table. I had turned on the voice recorder on my phone before I stepped into that hallway, she said. I don't know exactly why. Something felt wrong. In 9 years, you develop it's not instinct. Exactly. It's pattern recognition. The man with the briefcase was nervous. Your son was too smooth. Those two things together. She pushed the USB drive 1 inch closer to me. Everything I just told you is on that file. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The audio is clear. I was close enough. I picked up the USB drive. It weighed almost nothing. I said, why are you bringing this to me now? The hearing is tomorrow morning. She said, because I wasn't sure until today. I needed to know that I had understood what I saw. I spoke with the hospital's patient advocate this afternoon. She confirmed that no authorization was ever filed with this facility. No phone call was logged. No consent form was countersigned. She folded her hands in her lap. Your son told that man you had agreed. You hadn't agreed. I was there. I heard it. I held the USB drive in my closed hand for a moment. Then I called Diane. Oh. The Davidson County Courthouse opens its doors at 8 in the morning. Diane had filed for an emergency evidentiary hearing the previous week, and Judge Elaine Farrow had agreed to hear it at 9. I arrived at 8:15. The lobby smelled like floor wax and the particular stillness of public buildings before the day's business begins. Colin was already there when I walked into the courtroom. He was seated at the respondent's table with an attorney I didn't recognize, a younger man in a dark suit who had the alert, forward-leaning posture of someone billing by the hour and aware of it. Colin was wearing a gray jacket and a tie I had given him for his 30th birthday. He looked composed. He looked, I thought, like a man who had done the arithmetic and liked the numbers. He did not look at me when I came in. Judge Elaine Farrow took the bench at exactly 9 o'clock. She had been on the family court bench for 19 years, and she had the particular quality of someone who has heard every version of every story and has learned to distinguish the ones that hold together from the ones that don't. She wore reading glasses on a chain, and she set a yellow legal pad on the bench in front of her and uncapped a pen before anyone had said a word. Diane presented the case in the order we had organized it the night before. The original will, executed 11 years ago, witnessed and filed. The amended document, submitted to the county clerk's office 4 days ago, bearing signatures that the original notary Arthur Dempsey had certified. The timestamp on the amended document, a Tuesday afternoon, between 2:15 and 3:40. The hospital security footage, obtained through Patrice Holden's office, showing Walter Briggs me entering room 412 at 1:53 and not leaving until 4:07. Continuous footage, no gap, no exit. Colin's attorney said his client had obtained verbal authorization by phone. He said the signatures had been executed in good faith. He said the amendment reflected the genuine wishes of both parties. Judge Farrow looked up from her legal pad. She said, both parties. You're including Mr. Walter Briggs in that statement. Colin's attorney said yes. Judge Farrow wrote something on her legal pad. Then Diane said, Your Honor, we have an audio recording. It was made by a hospital staff member who was present in the hallway outside room 412 on the afternoon in question. With the court's permission, Judge Farrow said, Proceed. The recording lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I had not looked at the gallery when I came in. I had been focused on the table, on Diane, on the folder in front of us. But now, in the stillness before the recording started, I looked. There were perhaps a dozen people in the room. Near the back, in the third row, I recognized a woman I had not seen in 2 years. Helen Marsh, who had taught English at the same school as Margaret for 14 years and had been at our house for dinner more times than I could count. She had a canvas bag on her lap, the kind with a library logo on the side. She must have seen the hearing notice through the county's public filing system, or perhaps someone had told her. She was sitting very straight, with her hands folded on top of the bag. I looked back at the table. Judge Farrow did not look up from her legal pad while the recording played, but her pen was still. Colin's attorney leaned forward with his elbows on the table. Colin, for the first time since I had entered the room, turned his head slightly toward the speaker on Diane's table. I did not look at the gallery again while the recording played, but near the end, near the moment where Colin's voice said, "He just can't be here today," I heard the sound of something being set down. Carefully, deliberately. I glanced back. Helen Marsh had placed her canvas bag on the floor in front of her seat, both hands now free, resting flat on her knees. She was looking at the back of Colin's head. She did not look away. On the recording, Colin's voice was clear. He said the words Sandra had described to me the night before. He said I had agreed. He said I was sleeping. He said to let him sign, and I would add my signature later. There was a pause. Then the sound of a pen moving across paper. Then Arthur Dempsey's voice, quieter, saying something I couldn't fully make out on the recording. Then Colin's voice again. "It's fine. He knows. He just can't be here today." When the recording ended, Judge Farrow set her pen down. She took off her reading glasses and looked at Colin across the room. She said, "You told this court that your father provided verbal authorization for this amendment. The recording indicates that the notary requested direct verbal confirmation and was told your father was unavailable. Those are not the same thing." She paused. "They are, in fact, opposite things." Colin's attorney leaned over and said something close to Colin's ear. Colin looked at the table. Judge Farrow said, "I'd like to hear from the notary." Arthur Dempsey had been subpoenaed the previous afternoon. He was a man in his early 60s with the careful, unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades in a profession that rewarded precision. He had been a notary for 27 years. He sat in the witness chair with his hands folded, and he answered Diane's first 3 questions without hesitation. Then Diane played the recording again, just the section with Dempsey's voice. He was quiet for a moment after it ended. He said, "The young man told me his father had agreed by phone. I asked for direct confirmation. He said his father was resting and couldn't come to the phone." He paused. "I should have walked down the hall and knocked on the door myself. I know that now. I knew it then. I think. But he spoke with a great deal of certainty, and He stopped. "I accepted his representation. I should not have done that." Diane asked whether he had, at any point, spoken directly with Walter Briggs. Dempsey said no. Diane asked whether he had received any written authorization from Walter Briggs. Dempsey said no. Diane asked whether the certification he had affixed to the amended document, the certification stating that the signatures had been witnessed and verified, was accurate. Dempsey straightened slightly in the chair. He said, "I want to be clear that I acted in good faith on the representations made to me by the family. The young man, Mr. Colin Briggs, was present, was coherent, and spoke with full confidence about his father's wishes. In my 27 years of practice, when a family member of the patient presents themselves and provides a verbal account of authorization, it is standard professional practice to—" Judge Farrow said, "Mr. Dempsey." He stopped. She said, "The recording we heard this morning contains your voice asking for direct verbal confirmation from Mr. Walter Briggs. You asked for it. That means you understood it was required. What happened after you asked is not a question of standard practice. It's a question of what you did when the standard wasn't met." She set her pen down. "Please answer the question." The courtroom was very quiet. Diane played the recording again. Just the section with Dempsey's voice, 11 seconds. The words were the same as they had been the first time. "I need verbal confirmation directly from Mr. Briggs before I can proceed." Then Colin's voice. Then the sound of a pen. When it ended, Dempsey looked at the table in front of him for a long moment. He said, "No, it was not accurate." Judge Farrow set her pen down again. She looked at Dempsey for a moment, then at the documents in front of her. She said, "Mr. Dempsey, your certification on a fraudulent document, regardless of your intent, constitutes a serious breach of your professional obligations." She removed her glasses. I am referring this matter to the State Licensing Board with a recommendation for immediate suspension pending investigation. That referral will be made before the end of business today." Dempsey nodded once. He looked like a man who had already known it was coming and had decided not to argue. Collins' attorney made 2 more attempts. Judge Farrow heard both of them with the same still attention she had given everything else. Then she ruled. The amended document was voided. The original will was reinstated. The matter was referred to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation into fraudulent execution of a legal document and forgery of a signature on an estate instrument. She said it without raising her voice. She said it the way you state a fact that has been established and requires no additional commentary. Collins stood up when his attorney stood up. For a moment, he looked at the table in front of him, at the folder his attorney was closing. Then he looked across the room at me. It was the first time our eyes had met since the morning I had walked into Margaret's room and found the notepad with the words estate paperwork written on it in his handwriting. I looked back at him. I didn't say anything. I had spent 22 years in a profession that taught me the difference between moments that require words and moments that don't. This one didn't. The parking lot outside the Davidson County Courthouse faces east. At 9:40 in the morning in late November, the light comes in flat and cold off the concrete, and there are no trees to interrupt it. Colin came through the side door ahead of his attorney, moving quickly, his jacket collar turned up. The man in the blue windbreaker was waiting near the 3rd row. Diane had contacted him 3 days before. He was a civil process agent, not a uniformed officer, not a sheriff's deputy. He had a document in his hand, and he said Colin's full name once, clearly, and Colin stopped walking. The attorney said something. The man in the blue windbreaker said something back. Then he produced the handcuffs. I was standing on the courthouse steps. I had come out through the main door, which opens onto the top of the steps, and I had a clear line of sight to the 3rd row of the parking lot. I watched my son's hands go behind his back. I watched the attorney step away and take out his phone. I had been a private investigator for 22 years. I had stood in parking lots in the dark and watched through long lenses and written down license plates and waited in rental cars for hours without moving. I knew what it looked like when the thing you had been building toward finally arrived. I knew that the moment itself was almost always quieter than you expected. Not smaller, just quieter. I stood on the steps, and I watched, and I did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the morning had not already said more clearly than I could. After a moment, I went back inside to sign the copies Diane needed. Margaret passed away at 3:17 in the morning on a Tuesday. I know the exact time because Sandra wrote it down on the clipboard she was holding when she stepped into the room. She checked the monitors, made her notations, and then she looked at me just once, briefly before she set the clipboard on the small table near the door. She didn't say anything. She pulled the door most of the way closed, leaving a gap of maybe 4 inches, and I heard her footsteps move down the corridor and then stop. I sat with Margaret for 20 minutes. I held her hand. It was still warm for a while, and then it wasn't. I had been a private investigator for 22 years, which meant I had seen things I did not want to see and had learned to keep my face still when I saw them. That training did not help me in that room. I'm not going to describe those 20 minutes in detail. Some things are not for other people. What I will say is that the window above the bed faced east, and by the time Sandra came back to the door, there was a thin line of gray light beginning at the bottom of the sky. Margaret had always woken early. She liked mornings. That seemed right to me, in some way I couldn't have explained. Diane called at 2:30 that afternoon. I was in the hospital's family waiting area on the 2nd floor, drinking coffee from a paper cup that had gone cold while I was staring at it. She did not open with condolences. She knew I needed the information more than I needed the words, and she had known me long enough to understand the difference. The original will, executed in 2019, was fully intact and legally operative. The amended document Colin had filed through Arthur Dempsey had been voided by the court's emergency order, and the ruling from Judge Farrow's session 2 days prior had been entered into the county record. Everything the house in Brentwood, the joint accounts, The retirement fund belonged to Walter Briggs, as Margaret had intended when she signed her name in a notary's office on a Thursday afternoon 5 years ago, with her reading glasses on and a cup of tea cooling on the desk beside her. Colin was facing 2 charges: forgery of a legal document and will fraud. Diane said the district attorney was pursuing both. The sentencing range under Tennessee statute was 3 to 7 years, with the higher end more likely given the circumstances, the deliberate timing, the use of a hospitalized and incapacitated victim, the involvement of a licensed notary. Arthur Dempsey had already surrendered his notarial commission and was negotiating a cooperation agreement with the prosecution. He would testify. His lawyer had made that clear. I asked Diane why. I knew why. In a general sense, I had known something was wrong with Colin for longer than I wanted to admit, but I wanted the specific reason. The thing that had finally pushed him across a line I had believed, perhaps naively, that he would not cross. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said he owed $180,000. Online sports betting. He'd been doing it for about 3 years, apparently, and the debt had compounded. The people he owed were not patient people. He needed the money before Margaret passed and the original will took effect. I did not say anything immediately. I turned the paper cup in my hands. He knew the will, I said. He knew what was in it. Yes, Diane said. He'd seen a copy. Margaret showed him at some point she wanted him to know she'd provided for him through the trust structure, not a direct transfer. He didn't think that was enough. I thought about that. $180,000. 3 years of decisions. Each one probably feeling manageable at the time, each one a little worse than the one before. I had watched people make that kind of progression for 2 decades. I had documented it in reports and delivered those reports to people who did not want to read them. I had never expected to be reading one about my own son. I knew he had a problem. I told Diane. I didn't know it had gotten this far. She said that was the part she heard most often in cases like this. I told her I believed her. We discussed the next steps, a brief call the following week to review the estate documentation, and then I thanked her and ended the call. 3 weeks after the hearing, Diane called to tell me the district attorney had accepted the plea. Colin was sentenced to 4 years at the Davidson County Correctional Development Center, the lower end of the range, reduced in exchange for his cooperation in the case against Arthur Dempsey. His attorney had negotiated well. I did not have an opinion about that. 4 years was 4 years. He lost his position at the firm before the sentencing. His colleagues had known about the hearing through the public record, and the partners had made their decision quietly and without announcement, the way those decisions are usually made. 2 of his friends' men I had met at his birthday dinners over the years. Men who had shaken my hand and asked about my work stopped returning his calls sometime in the weeks between the arrest and the plea. He told me this himself. He called on a Thursday evening in February, 3 months after he had been processed in. The number came up as a corrections facility. I let it ring once before I answered. His voice was different. Not broken. Colin had always been too controlled for that, but quieter. The practiced evenness was gone. He said he wanted me to know that he understood what he had done. He said he had been thinking about it every day. He said he didn't expect anything from me. He said he just needed me to know. I listened. I did not say much. I did not tell him it was all right, because it was not all right. I did not tell him I didn't forgive him, because I hadn't decided that yet either. I told him I had heard him. I told him I would think about it. When the call ended, I set the phone on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment. The house was quiet. The Japanese maple in the front yard was bare for the winter. Through the window above the sink, I could see the last of the afternoon light on the back fence, where the hydrangeas had gone brown in November and had not yet come back. I told him I'd visit when I was ready. I haven't decided yet if I'm ready. The funeral was on a Saturday. 51 people came. Margaret had been a high school librarian for 26 years, and several of her former students drove from out of state. One of them, a woman in her mid-30s, told me that Margaret had been the first adult who ever told her that what she thought mattered. She said it the way people say things they've been carrying for a long time and are finally setting down. I shook her hand and thanked her for coming. Colin was not there. He had been released on bail, but his attorney had advised him to stay away, and for once in recent memory, he had followed good advice. 2 weeks after the funeral, I drove home to Brentwood for the first time in 14 days. It was a Wednesday afternoon, clear and cold, the kind of November light that makes everything look slightly more precise than it actually is. I had been staying at a hotel near the hospital for the first few days, and then with my brother and his wife for the remainder. They had offered to come with me. I told them I needed to do it alone. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The house was exactly as we had left it. Margaret had been admitted on a Tuesday morning, and neither of us had expected it to be the last time she walked out of that door. The progression had been faster than the doctors had projected. The heat had been set to 68. The way she always kept it in fall, the lamps in the living room were off, but there was enough afternoon light coming through the front windows to see clearly. Her tea mug was on the small table beside the sofa, blue ceramic, the one her sister had sent from Portland. There was a faint, dried ring inside it. Her book was on the cushion next to it, face down, spine bent back to hold the page. I looked at the page number, 214. She had been reading a novel about a woman who restores old maps. She had told me about it 2 weeks before she was admitted. She said it was slow to start, but that she thought I'd like it eventually. I did not move the mug. I did not pick up the book. I sat down on my side of the sofa, the left side, closest to the window, the side I had sat on for 31 years, and I looked out at the garden. The hydrangeas she had planted along the back fence had gone brown for the season. She had been talking about replacing 2 of the older ones in the spring. After a while, I took out my phone. I found Diane's number and called her. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Do you have a way to find a home address for a private individual, someone who works at Vanderbilt Medical?" Diane said she could find it. She asked who. "Sandra Okafor," I said. "She's a nurse in the ICU, night shift." There was a pause. "The one who—" "Yes," I said. "I'll find it," Diane said. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I set the phone on the cushion beside me and sat for a while longer, looking at the garden and the brown hydrangeas and the long, precise November light coming across the yard. The house was very quiet. It had always been a quiet house. Margaret used to say that was why she loved it, that you could think in a quiet house. I intended to send flowers, something simple. Sandra Okafor had done a thing that cost her something, time, risk, the discomfort of getting involved in a situation that was not technically her business, and she had done it because she thought it was right. In my experience, that was rarer than most people wanted to believe. I sat there until the light changed. If you've ever sat in a quiet house that used to hold someone you loved, watching a garden go brown for the season, and found yourself grateful not for what you kept, but for the stranger who thought it was worth the risk to tell you the truth, then you already understand why some things can't be measured in signatures or square footage or what's left on paper after someone is gone. There are more stories like this one here if you want to stay.